Alrighty, welcome to Esoteric Beat. I am super excited to have my good pal, Gabriel Mckee, on the show. I have been a fan of Gabriel Mckee's work, and let's be careful to spell his name with a lowercase k,
That is
uh,
correct.
because here on this show we believe, and this is something I say when I'm teaching all the time. I tell my students, like, you guys deserve to have your name spelled right or pronounced correctly. This is the minimum amount of respect that I can show to my guests. I like to make little pedagogical points on the show. Um, so, Dr. Mckee is
Not
you're
a
a
doctor.
I'm sorry.
Not a doctor.
Oh, you have a master's in
Two
library science?
two masters, yeah.
Okay,
Theological studies and library science.
Magister Mckee um,
Ooh, I like that. Okay.
is you're a research librarian.
Yes, that
Tell
is
us
correct.
about that.
So yeah, I'm a librarian at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at New York University. Which is a research institute for archaeologists and ancient historians. My background in religious studies kind of gives me a bit of coverage on all of the geographical areas and time periods that people are studying there, though it is a very material culture focused place. But my job is largely buying books and making sure they're organized and getting them onto people's desks when needed. So.
We are very excited about material culture studies on this show. I remember it was like a real hot topic in grad school, especially when I was looking into like the study of magic, which
Yeah.
we might touch on tangentially when we talk about Philip K. Dick. So I first got interested in your work through your book, Pink Beams. What is it? Pink Beams from the God in the Gutter?
Pink Beams of Light from the God in the Gutter, the science fictional religion of Philip K. Dick. We love a long title.
And one of the intersections with the interests of this show and our kind of esoteric studies project is you were looking at the research of Michael Allen Williams, who wrote
Yeah.
a sort of a deconstruction of the concept of Gnosticism that I think is a very fair point to make. And you were kind of debunking or clarifying a lot of the sort of uncritical takes, let's call them, on Dick's interest in Gnosticism. Can you give us a recap of your thesis in that book and where you're at on the study now, having become the Zebrapedia guardian?
Yes. So yeah, as I first got interested in religion in general through reading Philip K. Dick. So Valis was the first of his books that I read. It was kind of life-changing in many respects, and it was kind of my entree into both the world of Philip K. Dick, the world of science fiction, and the world of religion and theology, kind of all in one little package. So I got really interested in what Phil in that book and in the Exegesis refers to as Gnosticism or the Gnostics. And I made that a major research project, which turned into that book. But as I was researching it and reading up on this thing called Gnosticism, I came across the book that you mentioned, Rethinking Gnosticism by Michael Allen Williams, and his thesis is that this is essentially a construction of heresiologists that was then picked up by modern historians of religion in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but that it's really chimerical, that it's taking bits and pieces from individual texts and heresiologists' interpretations of those texts and false claims about those texts, and constructing from that a religious tradition of antiquity that may never have actually existed or may not have existed as a single unified thing, which is what it gets presented as. And that is really what Phil was working with. In the exegesis and in Valis, was that kind of mid 20th century understanding of Gnosticism of antiquity, that then Michael Allen Williams is saying, well, this we don't really have evidence that this existed in this form. And so my my question that kind of remains with me a little bit is, well, what do we do with Philip K. Dick then? Because he is having thoughts and insights based on this thing, which maybe is a historical misunderstanding. And so in what I came to, though, was in reading in what was available, the exegesis at the time. I was doing this research in like 2000, 2001 primarily, so pre Latham and Jackson edition of the exegesis, which we can talk more about
There
in a
was
little
what,
bit
like
on
300
that.
pages in the Sutton edition.
Exactly, yeah. And then, bits and pieces, a couple interviews that he had done with Greg Rickman towards the end of his life. And so there was a fairly scant corpus of material from those last 8 years outside of the published novels. That's the one, yes.
So
In
quick
Pursuit of
show and
Alice.
tell.
Yes.
Here is the Sutton exegesis. And I also have a kind of cool thing. This is the patch from Eric Davis's book.
Oh, nice. That is
Uh,
great.
Eric Davis, who also worked on the exegesis, right? So
Yes.
Sutton, who was Dick's biographer, who wrote The Divine Invasions, which is really one of those books that helped create the myth of the Gnostic PKD and was very into his
Yeah.
kind of Jungian studies, right? So let's talk then real quick about what we've learned since from the unpublished other 8,000 pages of material. Now, I suppose we should say a little bit, for the benefit of our gentle viewers. What is Zebrapedia? What is this exegesis material that was missing from the Sutton?
Yeah. So the Sutton edition is, you said, about 300 pages. It is sampler is really the way to put it. It's arranged thematically, so it's material from anywhere from 74 to 82, that he's kind of picked what he considered the best bits, and presented those as what was going to be the most interesting and useful to people. Um, Flash forward to 2009 or so, and Jonathan Latham spearheads this effort to publish more of the exegesis, not the entire exegesis, because that would be about 10 volumes at a cost of $1,000 or more, which 5 people would buy. I'd be one of them, but it's not going to be super useful in print to a lot of people. But he, I think, rightly recognized that there is more than 300 pages of good material in the exegesis, and that Sutton picked good stuff, but he left out a lot of great stuff as well. So with Pamela Jackson, who wrote a master's thesis on Philip K. Dick in, I want to say, the early 90s. Uh, he began work on editing more of the exegesis, which was going to be 2 volumes. It ended up getting kind of combined into one big volume that came out from Harcourt Brace in 2010. Am I right about that? Um,
Thereabouts 11,
Something like
12.
that.
Yeah.
But in order to, because it's the exegesis is, for those who don't know, is a largely handwritten journal that Philip K. Dick began in 1974 after he had some unusual experiences towards the beginning of that year, and he essentially just wrote and wrote and wrote what started out being notes for a novel and ended up just being notes for his own understanding of what the heck had happened to him. And this ran to, legend has it, 9,000 pages. Legend is not that far off. Uh, but when you consider that it's handwritten, a handwritten page is a little shorter than a full typed page. So realistically, it kind of translates to something a little less than that sounds like, I think. But it is still a massive document. Um, so and very difficult to access because he's and not just in terms of it being unpublished, but in terms of the actual content. He comes up with shorthand for describing experiences that he had, ideas that he's had. He'll refer back to something from 5 years before using like a 2-word shorthand that for him unlocks 16 pages that he had written back in 1974, but doesn't necessarily do that for the casual reader who's just dipping in. If he says meta abstraction and he'll say that 6 times in a page, you don't necessarily know that that is referring specifically and narrowly to him looking at the architecture around him in Southern California and seeing the architecture of ancient Rome in its place. That's what the meta abstraction is. I had read hundreds of pages of the exegesis before I realized that. So it's a difficult text to dip into. And so Leatham and Jackson, with the help of Eric Davis and Rich Doyle, got a kind of team of Philip K. Dick scholars, philosophers, etc., to write annotations for the exegesis. And so there are footnotes, some of them fairly extensive, in that Harcourt Brace volume by some really great people. Eric Davis himself, David Gill, Simon Critchley. I think there are 10 or so people in all. I was one of them. And so that was kind of intended to make that book more accessible to everyone, really. And it's great to see other people's insights and what they take from that massively complex text. Which brings us to Zebrapedia. So, as part of the arrangement with the Philip K. Dick estate for publishing that volume, they were able to secure permission to make even more of the exegesis available online, intended essentially for scholars, through a kind of transcription uh, platform called From the Page. So Rich Doyle is really the kind of mastermind of that. And that currently contains something like 2/3 of the complete exegesis. Um, and when it began, it was just page images of Phil's handwriting, which frankly is my favorite way to read this stuff, because I can read his handwriting. It's not necessarily the easiest handwriting to make out, but I find that kind of the most direct way to
I'm going
get,
to cut in for a moment and just say, in terms of the academic world and my appreciation of manuscript culture, all my friends who are academics who study manuscripts will tell you, you got to read the manuscript.
Yeah.
And this is a material culture studies kind of tangential point here, right? We're actually seeing, what it was like the messiness of it, the kind of disorganization of it. That's all kind of part of the evidence that we need to take into account, right?
Yeah, and you'll see his handwriting change, over the course of years, but even sometimes within a single page. I can't remember who it was, but I think it was Jonathan Latham that was theorizing that he was actively falling asleep when he was writing this, because this was primarily a late night project. And you will sometimes see, a thought will kind of end, and then it'll on the next there'll be like a little line break, and then the next line, he snaps awake again and is like, this is it, I have the answer. And very often it'll be 4:30 a.m. hypnagogic is a way that a lot of the entries in the exegesis start, and that really suggests he has just woken up and is writing down whatever dream or auditory experience he was just having as he was asleep or partly asleep. And so seeing his handwriting, you really get a sense of like, well, he's more wired here and more sedate here. And so that is a very useful thing to see. But transcription has been underway on that for a while. And basically, one of the contributors came up with a HTR engine for reading Phil's handwriting. So you've heard of OCR, optical character recognition. HTR is handwritten text recognition, which is teaching a computer to read handwriting. But of course, everybody's handwriting is different. So when you're working with a manuscript corpus, you need to teach the computer how to read the specific handwriting that you're working with. And I made an effort to do that and failed. And one of the other collaborators succeeded. And so everything has some level of transcription right now. But the computer makes a lot of mistakes. It puts, if he makes a little like caret insertion, it'll put it on the wrong line. A lot of the page images, because they're scanned from photocopies, have like a kind of artifact of the photocopier black line down the side that the computer doesn't know what to do with. So often there are errors and other kinds of mistakes that computers make when trying to read any kind of human writing, but handwriting especially. So it needs a lot of cleanup, and so that's kind of the stage we're at now. But there is some form of transcribed text that we can now search. You can tag. You can do things with. which is very exciting.
It really goes to show you the, I work a lot with LLMs now, and I think a lot about the problem of intentionality and kind of like what humans bring to the table that computers still can't,
Hmm.
for any of my viewers who are interested in getting into this sort of work, getting into esoteric studies, if you can do paleography, if you can read manuscripts, there's a million of them out there with stuff waiting to be discovered if you can just learn how to read it.
Yes,
A
and
lot
you're
of
reminding me of the tragic story that you shared the other day about what just happened with the Theosophical Society's collection, which was just destroyed by the wildfires in California.
And it's
And I was
hard to
very,
imagine that
very
was
sad to
all
hear about that. That was
digitized
yeah,
already.
yeah, it's a
It's
massive cultural loss.
it's a loss to esoteric studies that reminds me of the loss of the Terence McKenna papers, which burned up after a Quiznos caught fire
Oh wow.
in Monterey, and Esalen was keeping their stuff there. It was just a few years ago. And I had just been turned on, the Schwepp, the Secret History of Western Esotericism podcast, did a great episode on the debt that the study of religion, like writ large,
Mhm.
owes to the Theosophical Society, not only sort of ideologically, where the Theosophical Society was kind of saying, look, there's truth in every religion, and kind of inspired the Comparative Religion Project. They also funded it. And
Mhm.
there's a lot
Wow.
of, chairs that were endowed by theosophists. And people like Abner Doubleday were theosophists who invented baseball. There's all this great stuff. So huge loss. And one of the reasons I do this show is I want to kind of help people figure out, like, how do I do this sort of work, and inspire you to, just go do it. Just go. Like, I would have loved to read those GRS Mead letters, the guy who, his views on Hermeticism have been revived by Wouter Hanegraaff, where he says Hermeticism wasn't just this. And this is relevant to Philip K. Dick, if you'll excuse my tangent. I'm going to circle it back here with my next question. So, the Festugière and people like that who were reading the Hermetic corpus were saying, oh, this was just a book club by like Greek philosophers, who were kind of cosplaying Egyptian religion. And there was no, right? It's kind of similar to the Michael Allen Williams thing. There was no spiritual movement, right? There was no coherent Hermetic group, and now we think that the Hermetists are actually like, a kind of a movement. There was a cult, there was a religion there. Um, in the same way, coming back to your point, and I have kind of a two-pronged question here, so we'll have to tackle this in parts. Um, Scholars like my old live journal pal Dylan Burns, when I was, kind of beating the Williams drum, said to me, well, look, Ted, like, there are still these guys who called themselves the Gnostics, right? There are still these texts, there are still these, like Williams calls it demiurgic traditions, right? And when
Mhm.
Dick is talking about, the kind of the demiurge stuff, like there's a little bit there, right? There's a little bit of something there. However, you have found, and we can talk about your cool tool that you've got using a Python script. Although Dick was so excited by the Nag Hammadi, he doesn't write about it much, does he?
He does not. No, that phrase specifically appears. Well, I can show you in just a second. I think a total of 4 or 5 times in the entire exegesis. This is the phrase Nag Hammadi specifically. He does talk about the Gnostics all over the place, but it seems that his primary source was the Encyclopedia Britannica. And that is not to denigrate the edition specifically of the Encyclopedia Britannica that he had. This is not the World Book Encyclopedia. This was the 1970, I can't remember if it's 2 or 4 edition, which was a massive rewrite of the Britannica, that was divided into a micropedia, which is a little more of what you think of when you think of an encyclopedia, just kind of an A to Z of everything that there is, and a macropedia, which was I think 18 volumes of in-depth essays on specific topics. So smaller number of topics, but much more depth. And that is where he was primarily getting his information about most things. He also had the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And we know this because you can read in the exegesis, he's often writing out, quotes of things. And he will write out a specific quote about an idea, and you can trace that directly to, volume 6, page 372 of the Britannica Britannica is what he's quoting, or of the, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I cannot remember offhand the name of the scholar that wrote the Gnosticism article for the EB. The one in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy was written by Hans Jonas, author of The Gnostic Religion, major kind of esoteric work of scholarship of the early 20th century, but written before the Nag Hammadi library had been discovered, and certainly before it had been translated and made accessible to scholars, which really didn't happen until the mid to late 70s. Where was I going with that?
Well, so let me pick up, I'm interested in this Hans Jonas question. I think I showed you this book, Gnosticism and the History of Religions by, was it a Robertson, who said, and there's a nice Dylan Burns review of it I think I shared with you, and
Yeah.
Dylan kind of sees the point where the guy's saying, look, Hans Jonas and that crowd were sort of spinning Gnosticism, right?
Hmm.
Gnosticism is about direct experience. And the Eranos school believed that there was this like mystical core of all religions, kind of following on the theosophical thing, right? There's this mystical core of all religions, like, the essence of religion is to be mystical or to be Gnostic, right? And there's this idea of like direct experience based on like the interests of the phenomenological philosophers. Like Hans Jonas was in the school of like existentialism and phenomenology, if I've got this right, like following people like Husserl, and this is stuff that Dick was interested in, and people who are interested in phenomenology like love his work because he's just dripping with it, right? So it's understandable that Dick would be taken in by these authoritative scholars who were badass philosophers. We got people like Simon Critchley commenting on Dick's exegesis, legitimizing it. He just wrote a big book on mysticism, right? Are you familiar with what Critchley's doing on mysticism?
I haven't read it yet, but it is on my list.
He's sort of like defending mysticism, and but like Critchley's even doing this thing where it's like ecstasy is the essence of it, and we're going beyond rationality, and he's got an axe to grind too. We might worry about this. So and then another point is, first of all, it's great that we have this stuff. It's great that we have his sources, and I discovered when in my work on Hermeticism that Dick read an article in the E of Phil that was that's Encyclopedia of Philosophy, not Exegesis of Philip K. Dick. He read this article that was written by Francis Yates about Giordano Bruno. So like
Yeah.
I discovered that his take on Giordano Bruno as a Hermetic, alchemist, had to have been influenced by Francis Yates, and it turns out he was reading her directly, and it
Yeah.
turns out he had a copy of the Rosicrucian Enlightenment laid on him by Kevin Jeter, right? So it's like at the same time that we can say, he was getting it wrong. He was getting it wrong according to the sort of like mainstream of the study of religion getting it wrong, right?
Yeah. 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 Exactly. And that was where I was finding myself in this tricky place of like trying to make a place for him in the study of religion and theology, uh, 20 years on, when these things were not looked at the same way they had been looked at, at the time that he had been writing this stuff. And he's not around to catch himself up. Um, you reminded me of where I was going. One thing that I think is important to remember, is that, and you mentioned this with kind of the idea of Gnosticism being experiential as opposed to rational, and this idea that you have that emerges in that 19th century history of religion school of Gnosticism is this experience, this religion of direct experience, as opposed to the mediated religion of Orthodox Christianity. And you're stuck with this binary division between there's the orthodoxy on the one side and Gnosticism on the other side, that these are two things, and that there are only two things. And that's one of the kind of points that I always try to make, is that I think we have a lot more than two things, that orthodoxy wasn't orthodoxy at that time. Certainly in the works of the heresiologists, they are defending it as orthodoxy, as the right way to believe. There is a right way, it is original, and other ways of believing are tainted, that they came in later. And this is something that to me was kind of a misunderstanding of early Christianity that Walter Bauer kind of uh, disproved, that we have in early Christianity a kind of startling diversity of ideas. And so I don't want to take away the idea that, there are branches of Christianity that believe in an evil demiurge, or that there are branches that emphasize direct experience of something, and what that is may differ. But I don't want to lose that diversity. And what happens in positing a single Gnosticism is that you end up having the individual things stand for a larger whole, when in fact the texts in the Nag Hammadi corpus, for example, disagree with each other on pretty much anything that you can raise. And Michael Allen Williams goes through these kind of step by step, and says, well, if Gnosticism is supposed to be this, here's a text that supports that, and here's 5 that disagree with it. So one of the kind of clearest ones is on the idea of kind of hating the body, right? That we kind of think like, well, Gnosticism believes, right, that matter is evil, and therefore they denigrate the body and are into ascetic practices and things like that. And you have in Nag Hammadi texts that are saying asceticism is the way to go, and texts saying asceticism is ridiculous, don't do that. And so there's clearly a diversity of opinion in those texts. We don't even know specifically what that library was assembled to do. If it was intended for the use of a group, which I think was the assumption for a number of years, that there was a group of Gnostic Christians and this was their library. It may just as well have been a heresiological compilation, a collection of texts put together by monks. We believe the text came from a Pachomian monastery that's located not far from Nag Hammadi, as a kind of compendium of all the false ideas that were out there. And of course, those are going to disagree with each other. Those are just 2 possibilities of where these how these texts may have come to be assembled. And so I think remembering that there were lots of different ways of practicing religion in the Near East in the first few centuries CE, and that there's not necessarily this binary division between those who called themselves Orthodox and the people they called Gnostic. And if we try to maintain that distinction, then I think we're actually reinscribing that heresiological discourse, even if we're just flipping the values and saying, oh well, the ones who are into direct experience are the ones we like now. And so I think there are certain modern scholars who are trying to do that reinscribing and not necessarily looking at it as that. But I think it's a mistake. I think it's better to look at the text individually, and see what ideas are in the Apocryphon of John that aren't in, the trimorphic protonoia or what have you, that we look at them kind of on their own merits. And I think there are interesting historical questions to ask about the milieu that these texts came from, but I don't think we have the evidence to posit much of an answer. And that's unfortunate, but that's, what 2,000 years of history will do. So.
Now, I will say, I believe Dick was exposed to this idea, in the early centuries of Christianity. There were many forms of it. When he read Elaine Pagels,
Hmm.
we know that he had her book, right? But I don't feel like he
Yes,
writes a
I think
lot
so.
about her in the Exegesis. I can't even remember a reference to Pagels.
I think he does. I think Tessa has said he had a copy of her book, The Gnostic Gospels. I searched for a reference and didn't find one, but that doesn't mean that there isn't some. He may refer to it another way, just not by like her name or by the title. Um, but yeah,
There's
that's
a lot of reading between the lines one would have to do to sort this stuff out.
yeah.
Um, so I also feel like Dick is all over the place, like the Gospels you mentioned, in that his views kind of contradict themselves at various points in the exegesis. And so, for example, Blake Wilson made the argument that Dick rejects Gnosticism in the exegesis. There's other places where he goes, I've got it, the Gnostics were right.
Yeah.
Other places he says, I'm coming to like a Christian Platonism. Other times he says, I'm going to like this weird magical tradition that predates Christianity that like is going to destroy Christianity. And then in my favorite, he says, I'm going back to a Gnostic Hermetic Neoplatonism that's going to sort of be a vitalism that counters the vaunted rationalism that characterizes capitalism. He goes, maybe the Marxists were right, like Peter Fitting and Frederick Jameson, who wrote about his, did a deconstruction of Ubik as bourgeois, or no, Ubik as a deconstruction of bourgeois sci-fi, right? So Dick can't seem to decide. Now you, and I pretty much agree with this. You tend to see Dick's flirtation with Gnosticism as ultimately coming from the point of view of like a church-going Episcopalian who, opposed abortion. Like he was like a believing Christian, and most of his interests evidence the kind of research that a believing Christian who's had weird mystical experiences does to try to understand them. Or am I?
Especially when it's happening in the 70s. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so,
So,
yeah,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, you.
Yeah, I don't think I ever got at the beginning to what my thesis in Pink Beams of Light was, which is that ultimately Philip K. Dick is a Christian, and that he flirts with lots of different kinds of ideas, and he's a syncretistic Christian, so he brings in a lot of ideas. One thing I didn't underscore enough in that book is what I mean when I say Christian, because I don't necessarily mean strictly Orthodox. I simply mean one of the pieces he's trying to fit into the puzzle is not just his own experience. He's not just seeking a pure explanation of that from whatever source, but he also feels in a very fundamental way that somehow Christ has something to do with it. And that is a piece that he needs to fit into the whatever answer he finds. My cat is here. He's trying to jump onto my lap. So yeah, that basically, and I think I might have said this in the book, that Christianity is an assumption on the level of his original experience. So it's one of the he's got, you know, 18 pieces, and at any given time he's trying to fit 2 to 5 of them together. One of those pieces is always 2374, his experiences in February and March of 1974, and one of the other ones is Christianity in some way, i.e., the person of Jesus Christ, not necessarily the Orthodox Church. And so when he is interested in Gnosticism, he's interested in Gnostic Christianity. He's interested in Gnosticism not as maybe this was a thing that existed prior to Christianity that then got Christianized. He's not into the Sethian versus Valentinian split very much. He is interested in the idea that there was a branch of Christianity that was persecuted to extinction that believed something else, but was still Christian fundamentally. And so, to my mind, when he says the Gnostics, he means the Gnostic Christians. And he is using that as a shorthand for, among other things, the idea of a persecuted version of the Christian church. So yeah, that was kind of my fundamental thesis, was that he's always returning to one degree or other to some form of Christianity. I, to a certain extent, agree with Blake that he rejects Gnosticism, in part because it's almost an aesthetic argument, because the things that I react to the most in the exegesis, that I find the most powerful, and that I want to believe were the most meaningful for Phil, were what he talks about, this kind of logos-based experience, that Phil begins exploring, as opposed to that he kind of distinguishes between gnosis and logos being a more rational, and in many respects more orthodox, perhaps, if we can use that word, version of Christianity. Um, to me, one of the most meaningful parts of the exegesis is the oh my goodness, I'm forgetting the date, 11/20/80, the the theophany that he has, the infinity play again, where he's stacking up ideas, and he's in communion with the God of his fathers, as he says, and he is every theory that he comes up with launches 5,000 other series, and God just responds each time, that is infinity, that's me. And so this idea that whatever he's doing is still pointing towards, this transcendent God figure. And I think that's kind of it seems like that's something really transformative for him. Um, it also, though, if you read what follows directly after that chronologically in the exegesis, that's when he calls the exegesis a hell chore that has led to nothing. So he's not necessarily immediately looking at it that way, uh, but um, but it is, certainly an insight that I think has meaning.
There's a lot
Um,
of Kierkegaard to him, right? This kind of ironic
yeah.
stance, this like this angst and passion and fear and trembling.
Yes.
Um,
Um, the thing that's tricky though is, as you said, any theory that Phil presents, 5 pages later, he's refuting it himself. And I guess that's what I mean with the Hellshore thing. So I think it is tricky to say that there was ever a point where he had been thinking an idea and he rejected that idea and then he's done with it, because he is always going back and bringing back new ideas. So on the one hand, I'm cautious of saying, this is where he started and this is where he finished. And one of the reasons for that is because the exegesis as we have it is not really in any meaningful order. In Mayor Wilson's book, she describes the reasons for this. We don't really know how Phil was organizing it when he was alive. We have little hints of things. There are like Roman numerals that he was writing on pages, probably at some point in the early 80s, that may have been some attempt at editing or organization. But after his death, Mayor Wilson and Tim Powers were worried about what was going to happen with this journal. And so they went through his apartment, gathering as much of it as they could, and they hid it inside an Elvis Presley ashtray, so that it wouldn't be destroyed or seized by anyone, or hidden away, so that they basically wanted to protect it for posterity. But in doing that, they abolished any sense of order that it has, and I think that's, having it in no order is better than not having it at all. Um, but the so if you go to Zebrapedia, the organization there is just by folder numbers, folders 1 through, I believe, 81 or 91. Um, those are just numbers that Paul Williams put on them in the mid 80s when he was tasked with organizing this material. And it's just the order in which he was picking up a stack of paper. That would be 1, 2, 3, 4. And so it is essentially completely arbitrary. The material in folder 1 does have the kind of title page of the exegesis that he wrote in 1981, but there's obviously material, a lot of material that precedes it and a lot of material after it. So folder 1 is not, a beginning in any meaningful sense. In fact, the earliest material is in what is folders 4 and 5 in that organization. So one project that I really want to undertake with Zebrapedia in the next year or two is looking through everything and trying to get a better sequence for it. And there's a little bit of this that's been done. Pamela and Jonathan had assigned rough dates to every folder, but there is mix of dates in individual folders. Some of that because of Phil's apparent organization, and some just because of the kind of haphazard way in which this was preserved and assembled. But there's a lot of internal evidence where he'll say, I went to see this movie, and that's a movie that we know came out in 1979. So, certainly that entry was not written before that. It was probably written when that was in the theater in Fullerton, and so we can sometimes get to more specific dates. He does sometimes date the entries, but it's not very often. But I think we can certainly, at least to the level of year, date pretty much everything in there. And I would like to get an actual, as close to a real sequence. This is where it began and this is where it ended of the exegesis. And one of the things that will enable us to do once we have that is get a better sense of, well, this is an idea that he did have and discussed a lot in 1975 and 76 and then dropped. And then, but until that's done, I'm cautious of making too many statements about finality. Another thing to be cautious about there is that just because an idea is earlier doesn't mean it's worse, and just because it's later doesn't mean it's better. And I think there's no better example of that than the Greg Rickman's final interview, which was just from a few days before Philip K. Dick's death, where all he can talk about is Benjamin Creme, who is not someone that I would ever accuse of having a special claim on the truth. Let's put it that way. It's just kind of a bit of a new age grifter. From the 70s and 80s. Um, and I don't think that should be, the final, like, this is what Philip K. Dick really believed. It's just the thing that he was obsessed with the week that he died. And it's, in a way, it's unfortunate that he hadn't had a better idea, before Greg showed up that day. It was just what was on his mind, during the week or so of those final interviews.
There's a cool moment in those interviews where he goes, "You should really see my notes." And he tells
Yes.
Rickman about the exegesis, and that I've pointed to as evidence in the debate about, did Dick want this stuff to be read, right?
Mhm.
And like Jay Kinney warned us that like it might turn into a Gnostic religion if people go and read this material, right?
Yeah.
Um, so let me get your take then. I'm really interested in how, I mean, all that we've said about the exegesis seems to lend itself to some sort of a digital edition. We don't have quite that yet with Zebrapedia. Can you give me your take as an information scientist on the platform that we're using and sort of like what else do we need to do to really like grapple with this material, make it accessible, and kind of organize it and present it?
Yeah, sure. So the vision for Zebrapedia is to have lots of hyperlinking and annotations and group, ways to group things thematically. Kind of the Lawrence Sutton approach of, the way to look at this is by what ideas is he talking about, and that's really, I think, what the hyperlinking approach will get. And I can here I'll share my screen. Oh, you'll need to turn on screen sharing, but that's okay. That'll give me a second to
Oh, I
load
need
the
to give you permission. Sorry, let me
here.
see. Multiple participants can share. And then do I need to give you permission as a
All right, here we go.
allow to? Oh, there you go. Cool.
All right, so you seeing that? So this
Yeah,
is
so this is Zebrapedia. This is the website, and it's a
Wikipedia.
platform called From the Page.
From the page, yes. That's the platform that it's currently in, and as you can see, it is, organized by folder number at the moment. Um, But if we let's just start at folder one, you'll see these are hyperlinks. So these were added by Zebrapedia users, these links. And so let's click on Acts. And so this is going to bring us to, a brief description of the Acts of the Apostles. What does Phil mean when he says Acts? This is another shorthand word that we're going to see a lot. It is the book of Acts in the Bible, but he's referring specifically to having seen the world of Acts, in that meta abstraction, seeing the Roman Empire. But he talks also a lot about the Acts material in Flow. And so that's the end of Flow My Tears, the policeman said, where there's this scene that he believes is a rewriting of a scene in the Acts of the Apostles. And so that's a thing that turns up a lot. And this thing is really cool. I don't fully understand how it always how it works necessarily, but uh, From the Page has this thing that will build a like map of, subjects mentions frequently with acts. And so this is kind of a topic map of what ideas are related to this. So anamnesis is one, time is one, because obviously he's talking about having seen some kind of disruption in time. Jim Pike is closely associated. That's interesting. Flow My Tears, of course, as I was just saying. Astral determinism, that's what my presentation at the Dick Fest last year was all about, is Phil's use of the idea of astral determinism throughout the exegesis. And so this, I think, is kind of a digital version of what Lawrence Sutton was doing with his thematic approach to the exegesis. The other thing, and you alluded to this earlier. Nope, that's the wrong window. Bear with me a second. Well, I find it.
So
Oh yeah.
there's a
green
way
window.
to search that you created based on, oh, and you're using Jupyter Notebook. I know what that is now that I'm
Yeah.
studying Python. So my understanding is there's a way to search the kind of chronological spread of all these things where we know what folder goes with what year, and you can
Yes.
search a term and get a kind of a heat map of how much you use that term over the years.
Yeah. So this is a thing that I built in Jupyter. And this is I would love to get this integrated with the Zebrapedia site. I think that's a little ways off. But I was saying Nag Hammadi is not mentioned very often. In the available exegesis, the two-thirds that are in Zebrapedia, it is only mentioned by the term Nag Hammadi 3 times. So that's one thing but we can dig a little deeper. He does talk a little bit more often about Yaldabaoth, this character from the Apocryphon of John and other texts.
Hmm.
So that appears 16 times. So it's not like he's never referring to material, but talking about Nag Hammadi specifically does not happen terribly often. So something else we can do though is let's put in just the word Gnostic. So I have what this is searching is an roughly chronologically organized. So this is not a strict dated chronology, but the document that it's searching is in rough chronological order from 1974 to 1982, and so we can see where this word appears most often. And so we do have for Gnostic, for example, we have a few mentions very early, then a long gap where he doesn't talk about it quite as much, but then it's pretty frequent throughout the whole exegesis, right? So that's maybe not the best example, but let's see, where does he talk about Yaldabaoth? So I'll enter that into my code here, and that's something that appears. And to my point about he never really rejects something, appears a lot very early, very long gap where he doesn't talk about it. These 3 or 4 lines here are probably in like 1979 or so, maybe or maybe 77. I can't quite get dates on this yet. So that's a future thing. But then we have another mention way, way, way at the end, in 1981 or 1982. So that's definitely an interesting one.
I
Let's see, the
remember
last
at the
time.
fest, I asked you to search Torah, right? And it turns out he
Yes.
starts using Torah kind of halfway through and then uses it solidly all the way.
And
Like he got into this Kabbalistic period or something.
I think this was the last time that I played with this because that's the
Oh,
text
there
that
it
was
is.
still in here. So yeah, we do have so this is a we you can kind of look at words against each other, and see that, so I put in Testament because he's very often talking about either the Old or the New Testament when he says that. Hebrew, almost always going to be referring to the Hebrew Bible, and we can actually look up here at the concordance and test that hypothesis. Hebrew concept, Hebrew idea of God, Hebrew priest, Hebrew Exodus, Hebrew religion. So, in any event, and then Torah, as you said, is an idea that he does not talk a lot about, or at all about, really, from say 74 to 76, and then becomes dominant, from probably 1977 or 78 on. Um, and certainly a subject that influenced Divine Invasion and other later works. So yeah, any other words we should plug in here?
Well, so I mean, another one I asked you to do at the fest was Giordano Bruno, because that's my guy, right?
Right.
And there's this place where Dick says, clearly Giordano Bruno is my main man. And
Yes.
I just love the way he uses that kind of colloquialism, right? And so, but I see that the Bruno drops off, but Burma he
Yeah.
stays interested in.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's an interesting one for sure. Um, but yeah, so this is yeah, kind of, in early days, this tool. And like I said, I would like to get this integrated with the website in some way. I'm not entirely sure how that would happen at this moment because we've got a little bit more digitizing and transcribing and correcting to do before this is really ready for prime time. So at the moment, this is just a proof of concept sort of thing. But yeah, this is something that I really want to get integrated with the main Zebrapedia site, and certainly look forward to playing more with and seeing what kinds of things what kind of questions we can ask using that. Um, with that kind of distant reading of the exegesis, which is really, I think, an ideal text corpus for doing this kind of thing because it is, it's one person, one very distinct period of time, but also a little more complex than you could hold in your mind all at once. And so having a little computer help to organize and kind of poke at that text is really, really handy.
It's sort of a laboratory for thinking about computational methods in the study of literature. And but I mean, so there's the literature thing. There's like, what does this say about Dick's literary art and his kind of
Mhm.
like art of bullshitting, his like conversational style on the one hand, and then there's this stuff as like a religious studies topic, right?
Yeah. And yeah, both of those things are definitely there and really integrated with each other, I think, in a lot of ways. But the thing that I like about the exegesis so much is I think there's very, very little distance between what Phil is thinking and what the pen is writing. I think it's he is really thinking by writing in the exegesis. And so you're kind of getting the thoughts as soon as his mind mints them. Um, and some of those thoughts go nowhere. But kind of seeing that happen is you know there aren't very many texts where you can get it certainly not at that scale for one person's thought and somebody really fascinating to boot.
And we need sort of new methods for studying this stuff because it's so contextual, it's so intertextual. He's often referring in shorthand, things that you might not have available. And how do we kind of make that present, right?
Yeah, especially with his as you said, the shorthand that he uses, where and sometimes it's not what you'd expect. So like for him, John Calvin, when he mentions Calvin, what he is talking about is not, predestination or, institutes of the Christian religion or anything. He's talking very narrowly about the idea that before the fall in the Garden of Eden, human beings had superpowers, which is something that he got somewhere, probably mentioned, in the Encyclopedia Britannica or something, bit of a throwaway thought in the source, but that's what he latched on to. And so, yeah, and that's where annotation and being able to read this text collaboratively with other people who have been looking into other aspects of it is really helpful because maybe they've kind of made a connection between page 1 and page 7,000 that you haven't made.
It's really difficult to study experience.
Yeah, for sure. There's a distance between it because you can't recapture that experience that's being written about. And part of what Phil's trying to do in the exegesis is get his own handle on his own experience. So he's kind of doing the same thing that you as a reader might be trying to do, right? You're trying. He's trying to get there, and you're trying to get there. So you're kind of working together with him
And he like
on that.
loses his grip on it. He's experiencing the eclipse of God, right? He's like, I wish that I could have this state of grace descend on me again. And
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
trying to bring it
absolutely.
back through the writing, right?
Yeah.
Um, so so I want to get your take then. You were saying, we talked about the literary art versus the religious studies stuff and how they kind of come together. And so there's this thing that Samuel Umland said in his study of Upon the Dull Earth in his book PKD Contemporary Critical Interpretations, where he said, the Gnostic stuff that people make such a big deal about is happening late in Valis, right? Like, that's just an example of these religious themes that go all the way back in his work. Upon the Dull Earth is this early, like, dark fantasy story that depicts a kind of like allegory of ritual purity and like this like angel summoning ritual. I won't spoil the creepy ending, which is one of the like greatest horror images in all of Dick. And Umblin said, look, we need to approach Dick through these Aranos thinkers, the comparative religion guys, the the hermeneutics of religion, stuff like Hans Jonas, Carl Jung, Henri Corbin, the whole and Mircea Eliade, right? Um, what's your sense of his contact with comparative religion in the exegesis?
I mean, I think a lot of it comes through Jung, as you kind of implied, that he as he told it, he was reading Jung like from his mama's knee, because she was very into Jung and his writing, and he talks about how he and Cleo were always reading Jung together. And so that's something that precedes his religious experience by decades. And so it's definitely you know, no matter how you slice it, is going to be a major part of his approach to what ended up, consuming his life in the last decade. Um, so yeah, I think that is a very big piece of the puzzle for him, and maybe even to the point of being, like I said, there was his own experience. There's Christianity in some form, and I think Jung is another piece of the puzzle that he's pretty much always trying to fit into whatever explanation he's playing with on any given page.
So Magister Mckee is kind of like a rock star. He has been very patiently playing the old stuff, right? Like I want to hear like the tunes that I'm familiar with, right? And play some free bird here, but he's very patiently waited and indulged me in my Phil Dickian stuff. But we're here to get around to talking about your new book, your forthcoming, super exciting, already well reviewed by Eric Davis, the Dean of Weird Studies, cool book on this UFO character. And I want to set the stage with a sort of a segue, right? We've talked about sort of the myth of the Gnostic PKD. We've talked about, I would have liked to talk more about kind of his influence and how he's sort of like transmitted that vision of Gnosticism, which, Hanegraaff talked about the Aranos school being like pitching towards a kind of countercultural mentality. And Francis Yates is the same way. So when he's excited about Giordano Bruno, it's like, so is Timothy Leary. There's this like Gnostic myth of PKD. And we're talking about doing kind of like literary analysis, right, in terms of like our methodology. But we're also trying to understand extraordinary experience. And so by some strange synchronicity, you have stumbled upon a project that is doing something, let's say, similar. In your book, um, you're talking about this guy who sort of started the UFO thing. Tell me
Yeah, so
about your guy.
absolutely. So the book is called The Saucerian, UFOs, Men in Black, and the Unbelievable Life of Gray Barker. As that title implies, it is a biography of Gray Barker, who was a UFO author and book publisher who was active from the 50s through the early 80s, kind of contemporaneous with Phil's career in a really interesting way, actually. Um, and he was a bit of a P.T. Barnum kind of figure in the UFO world. He was definitely a sensationalist, kind of saw himself in opposition to the field of scientific ufology that was attempting to develop itself in the same period. And he was very much more of a storyteller, and looked at this kind of things that he was presenting much more as folklore. Um, and kind of ultimately, in a way, I think ghost stories that he was trying to scare his audience with. And he's a really fascinating character. That project began with a project that I had worked on with the UFO book collection of science fiction author Jack Womack, who is a really great book collector and had a very impressive collection of UFO books, which are now at Georgetown University. I had the privilege of working with that collection, and that was kind of my entree into the world of UFO books as a kind of uh, area of scholarly interest. And as I was going through that collection, I just things kept popping up that were, the books with the weirdest titles, or the craziest illustrations were either authored or edited by Gray Barker, published by Saucerian Books, his publishing house, which was based in Clarksburg, West Virginia. And those were the things that were kind of jumping out at me from that collection as being the most interesting. So it really began as a bibliographical project. I wanted to explore, what books did this guy put out? Because they're aesthetically striking. They have this kind of uniform design for the most part. Um, and I just kind of wanted to know more about what these books were and how they came to be. A lot of them he printed on office copying equipment, so he was really kind of self-publishing in this kind of avant punk DIY aesthetic. Um, and as I learned more about him, I realized that he was really a kind of prime mover in the world of UFOs and flying saucers in a lot of ways that would not necessarily be readily apparent. So his zine, the Saucerian, was among the first flying saucer fanzines. It was launched in 1952. I think there were only three or four kind of zines in that world that existed before then. And those zines are really what kept interest in UFOs alive as a kind of mass cultural phenomenon. They've had a few peaks of interest. In fact, I think we're really in one right now for the last couple of weeks with all the drone sightings in New Jersey. It's a thing that kind of enters the public consciousness and then drops out for years or even decades at a time. And so he launched his zine in 1952, which was right around the time that public interest was really fading. From the, 1947 to 52 was this kind of first period. So he was kind of responsible for, in a lot of ways, for keeping this alive in a subcultural way, such that there was something for mass culture to be drawing from when interest came back at a couple points later in the century. Um, so among the kind of ideas that he is primarily responsible for are the Men in Black, the idea that there are, some kind of force that wants to silence UFO witnesses. That was a major narrative that he kind of promulgated, and in late in his life claimed he invented out of whole cloth. He was drawing on someone else's experiences, so there's a little bit of grain of salt to take with that.
Wasn't it
But
kind of like
certainly
a
he was.
prank?
I mean, that's another podcast conversation, which I would definitely love to have, is the details of Albert K. Bender's experiences. Um, but yeah, essentially, one of his friends, his kind of closest associate, was this guy named Albert K. Bender, who very quickly in 1953, really right after Gray Barker had gotten into the UFO world, shut down his organization, claimed that he had been visited by three men in dark suits who told him, like, no more UFO stuff. You've got to drop this. And Gray Barker then spins this into a narrative by linking other people's stories that don't necessarily line up with that experience when you really look at the details, but he presents them in ways that they do, and kind of bends the truth to make it appear that this is a single phenomenon. And then that later gets picked up by people like John Keel in the 60s and early 70s, and then eventually becomes, a blockbuster movie franchise in the 90s.
Right.
So um, with a very different approach, of course, to what that means.
So your guy, sorry, Barker, uh,
Mhm.
was he wasn't the first, he was like a popularizer of the UFO. Like, what's the origin, right? What's his proximity to the origin of the UFO myth?
Yeah, so he is I wouldn't say certainly not a latecomer. He's not one of the first people, and he's kind of but his zine is early. So the kind of flying saucer thing starts in 1947. Gray Barker becomes interested in 1952. So it's been around for a couple years. But really what's happened in those first few years is that the people who are interested assume that the government is going to tell them the answer. And by 1952, people have, people that care have decided this probably is not the case. And if we want the truth, we're going to need to find it for ourselves. And so he's kind of part of that wave. Um, and my cat is on my shoulder now. So that's the time where you have the first kind of flying saucer study groups like the Aerial Phenomena Research Association starting up, and Albert Bender's group, the International Flying Saucer Bureau, was one of these. And Gray Barker had a pretty big role in that organization, but it was a pretty short-lived organization. Um, and so, he was kind of turning that organization and what happened to it into a story that he could continue to tell in the absence of having an institution through which to kind of tell it. Um, so yeah, fascinating character, great writer. His first book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, is well worth a read. It's a real page turner. My personal favorite is The Silver Bridge, which he published in the early 70s. It's the first book dedicated to the Mothman, which was a West Virginia cryptid, spotted in 1966 and 1967. Probably best known from the book The Mothman Prophecies by John Keel, but The Silver Bridge precedes that by a few years and is trying to do a very different thing.
Hmm.
He was very aware of the fact that what he was writing about was not necessarily things that existed in phenomenal reality, but stories that people were telling. And he saw himself as having a role in how those stories were told, how they were promulgated. And he is writing kind of poetically in The Silver Bridge, but really directly, I think, about what his role is and what those stories are and mean. Um,
So
and
if I'm
that's really,
getting this right, sorry to interrupt, are you saying he's sort of self-consciously transmitting a myth that he's kind of like I think the word artistic liberties might come up, right? Like he's kind of bullshitting.
yes, yeah, I think so, and in a really Philip K. Dick kind of way, where yeah, he is very much seeing in a way what he can get away with, and seeing how far he can take things. So he was definitely a prankster. He did promulgate some hoaxes. He made a couple fake flying saucer photographs and movies. The models that he was filming are in his archive, which is at the Clarksburg Harrison Public Library, which has a West Virginia Regional History Center. So where his archive sits, and that archive really made this book possible. Um, and yeah, he was looked at the kind of world that he was working in as something that was very much a narrative that he wanted to work on and shape. Um, but what kind of the approach to the entire kind of question of flying saucers, UFOs, whatever you want to call them, that I came to it after doing the research in his archive was really narratological. That these as with Philip K. Dick, you cannot get to the truth of the experience. You're not going to have you can't make yourself have a 2374 experience. You can't make yourself see a UFO. All that you have is the stories that other people have told you. Even if you do have such an experience, even that is a story that you're telling yourself. That your experience of it, your memory, a memory is essentially a story that your brain is telling to itself. And so, really, I was approaching the whole thing as something built out of narrative. That the kind of quantum of unusual experience is narrative, is a story. Um, and it is a story at every level. Even if you're seeing something in the sky in that moment, your eyes are telling your brain a story, and your brain is telling itself, where does this fit in? Um, and what that often ends up being, with UFO sighting, for example, is you're fitting it into a cultural narrative of UFOs that you've been exposed to through mass culture. And that makes it a kind of bibliographical question of, what is the bibliographical history of a specific narrative? What kind of stories preceded it and fed into the interpretation of it? Um,
And
and
so
so,
Barker is less of, I mean, my image of the UFO believer is like this kind of credulous, like true believer. But Barker's kind of more complicated than that.
definitely more complicated, more impish, for sure, and very cagey about what he believed. And there are kind of two main approaches, which is he believed everything and had a secret truth. There are people that will attempt to convince you of that on the internet today, or he was completely cynical and didn't believe in anything and was just in it for the money. And I don't think either of those is quite right. For on the in it for the money side in particular, he lost a lot more money on UFOs than he ever made. He declared bankruptcy in 1963 specifically because he had spent all his money publishing books. So this was not something that he was making a mint on. He was, maybe eking out a living. It was never his main occupation. He always had other jobs throughout his life. Um, and so certainly I can't quite accept the he was fully cynical explanation, because it doesn't, if you just want to make money, there are a lot better ways to do it.
But at the
So,
same time, he didn't feel shy about embellishing. He didn't feel shy about, letting the narrative run away with itself.
yeah,
And the
definitely not.
culture bought into that.
The culture bought into it, and the subculture specifically, a certain segment of it bought into it. By, even the late 50s, the kind of more serious ufologists rejected anything that he said out of hand. They viewed him as somebody who had kind of played fast and loose with the truth one time too many, and so they didn't tend to trust him. But at the same time, and this is kind of the tricky thing that I try to explore in the book, they were also adopting and accepting and promulgating ideas that he had presented them with. They're just trying to kind of blur the origins of it, or forget the origins of it, or actually had forgotten the origins of it. And so the Men in Black thing is a great example of that, where, by 1966, serious ufologists thought that Gray Barker was full of crap, but then they were also really latching on to these stories of, people trying to silence UFO witnesses, which is entirely the like narrative that he had kind of maybe played the fastest and loosest with
Well,
a
it
few years
plays
earlier.
it plays so well into like a post Jim Garrison, like the 60s, like the hermeneutics of suspicion of like the CIA killed Kennedy, kind of stuff. You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And he was playing with these conspiracist ideas that were bubbling away, from the early 50s in the UFO scene. The idea that there's a government cover up, and really the UFOs are the first kind of sparkling of there being a popular conception of the government is hiding something from you. That's really the first one, instance of that becoming an idea that people would accept. And so then, yeah, yeah, Jim Garrison, that becomes a much more prominent thing in the decades to come. But UFO conspiracism is where it ultimately started, if you trace it back to its roots.
So speaking of conspiracism, you engage with the work of Michael Barkan, A
Mhm.
Culture of Conspiracy. Can you tell us about that research?
Oh yeah, so I mean I don't know if I build too much on it so much as draw on it, because he is really kind of the go-to guy for conspiracy belief. Um, yeah, that's just yeah, Culture of Conspiracy is his book, and that's um, traces the kind of epistemology of conspiracism. How this comes to be a thing that one thinks, and how it is distinct from other ways of looking at the world.
So there's kind of a sociological dimension to this study as well as like a literary textual dimension to it.
Yeah, yeah. Certainly a sociological one. I would say the main threads for me are the bibliographical, the actual like meat of the, physical stuff of the books that Gray Barker printed, the literary analysis, um, and folklore ultimately, the idea of the analysis of how stories grow and change through retelling was one of the main kind of threads of this, and then also just history written a little more broadly, and archival research, having access to his archives. And Yeah, those are kind of the real big threads that I was weaving together in this project.
I'm curious if you have any thoughts about the work of Jacques Vallée, who I understand connects the UFO experience. And I learned about him through like Robert Anton Wilson, who kind of like even brings Philip K. Dick's like as a contact experience into this. Like, do you think that there's anything to Vallee's thesis that like UFO experience or sort of a species of contact experience that has continuity with like angelic and demonic visitations and other kind of spiritual entities?
Yeah, so there's definitely a connection between ballet and folklore. It's a bit of a different ta take on it than I use, because he's looking at these are real things that are happening where are earlier places in culture where similar things have been described. Whereas I'm looking at these are stories, those are stories. It's a little more narratological, my approach. So I really avoid playing what I call the truth claim game, which is, latching onto, well, there's a phenomenological reality to any of these stories. Uh, I am pretty completely agnostic on that, because at the level that I'm interested in them is at the level of story. And so I think Valet is more interested in establishing a empirical truth that is really not a part of what I'm interested in doing, because that's not what I'm looking at. I'm looking at the stories.
So on a related note, and coming back to Philip K. Dick, right, we talked a lot about how, this literature that Dick wrote, this exegesis that he wrote, is sort of about exploring his experiences. Like, where are we at as religious scholars, as textual scholars on the question of like what did Dick experience, and is it just a story, or is it like is there an experience that we need to kind of account for? Do you see the problem I'm trying to gesture at here?
Yeah, yeah, and to me, I think, as I mentioned, I think we're not going to recreate or fully comprehend that experience, and this is really the case with any kind of mysticism. You can read an account of it, but what you have is an account, right? You don't have the experience itself. But I don't think we should fret too much over that, because those accounts are fascinating, right? And they have, we can analyze them as literature. We can look at the philosophical or theological ideas that they end up being the underpinning for. And that's really what I think is most interesting for PKD and the exegesis, is looking at the ideas that Dick developed, um, and what they meant for his life. And so, for example, my Dickfest talk, which became a chapter for a book that's supposed to come out later this year on the esoteric theology of Philip K. Dick, is about the idea of astral determinism, the idea that the stars control your destiny. Um, and that connects not so much to, is this empirically true? Do the stars actually control our destiny? I was looking at it a little more um, autobiographically for Phil, or even psychoanalytically on a certain level of, what is he using this idea to say about himself? And it is that he saw himself as having been not in control of his actions, and then through these experiences that we cannot, fully comprehend or recapture, he felt liberated. And so this idea of control or determinism and liberation is really the ultimately interesting thing in that. Apart from, any factual, it was God or Bishop Pike or the three-eyed aliens from Sirius. Those are not the fundamentally interesting things, but the idea that he was using these concepts and exploring this experience to explore this idea of control and liberation is really where, I see the most interesting and fruitful stuff.
Yeah, where I'm at with it, with my Philip K. Dick tarot is, kind of building on that quote that I said about I'm going back to a Gnostic Hermetic Neoplatonism. I really see Dick's work as like interrogating. Uh, Kim Stanley Robinson said Frederick Jameson told him Dick is an instinctive anti-capitalist, right? And Dick
Hmm.
dramatizes the way that capitalism sort of isolates us with these spurious realities. And one of the things that was exciting about Gnosticism is that it's like it's this vision of freedom, and becoming free of astral determinism is sort of like becoming free of, like abstract labor and like mystification, and kind of I'm definitely taking a very Marxist kind of view here, right? Where he's like, this allowed me to kind of like see through the like lies that underpin the rat race,
Yeah.
and so like to study this, we should be looking at, well, how does he define freedom? Like what's the language that he's using? What sort of stories does he tell? And we can use this as a lens to understand his literary art, right? Where we look at his stories and see, is he telling kind of like Gnostic allegories, like Eric Davis talked about the Gnostic hymn of the Pearl, right?
Hmm.
You're familiar with that one where the prince goes down into Egypt and he has to like put on these clothes that make him forget his identity. And then he comes into contact with this disinhibiting information, right? And he has the anamnesis experience. Like, is Dick writing those kind of parables? And like, are his characters experiencing limitations and potential freedoms and that sort of thing? Um, there's another concept you talk about, this idea of stigmatized knowledge. Like, what is the knowledge that the UFO guys are, I mean, bracketing the reality question, bracketing the truth question. um we have to do a sort of like sociology of scientific knowledge kind of a practice here to kind of figure out what are we talking about when we talk about the kind of knowledge that this guy is putting into his stories.
Yeah. I mean, so yeah, stigmatized knowledge, the idea that, it's ideas that are too dangerous for mainstream culture. And that's, an idea that goes back at least to Charles Fort, um, which his books of the 20s. Um,
The Book of the
and yeah,
Damned.
yes, Book of the Damned. So yeah, that's a place where interesting things happen, for sure.
And we kind of
Uh,
see Dick like excited about the stigmatized knowledge, and I'm going to lay it out for you, like, this is the secret that's being kept from you, right? Almost like putting on a tinfoil hat at times.
yeah, yeah. But what's really interesting there is really more the idea of the picture of the world that's constructing as one that is divided into the apparent and the hidden. Um, and that goes back well before Charles Fort, as you no doubt know. So
Yeah, and I mean, Walter Hanegraaff, right, has used this concept of forbidden knowledge to characterize Western esotericism. And do we see Dick partaking of that? Do we see your guys partaking of that? Like, can we tell a story of the UFO myth and like continuity with like the theosophy or like the New Agers that you mentioned? I recently learned from Tessa, Dick, that PKD said that Jane Roberts, who wrote the Seth books, not to be confused with Sethian Gnosticism, Seth the like alien entity, that she was full of shit.
and you're reminding me also that Phil corresponded with Brad Steiger,
Oh,
who
right.
somebody who wrote a lot about. Well, he wrote particularly one book about religious mysticism, but he wrote a lot of books about UFOs and Atlantis and all manner of Fortean topics. Um, and so that's certainly a world that Philip K. Dick was crossing over with at certain times. And even Benjamin Creme, who I mentioned earlier, had been a big figure in the Aetherius Society, which was a British UFO religion of the 50s. I actually just learned that today. Uh, so yeah, there definitely is crossover between some of the things that PKD was playing with in his explorations, and some of these yeah, kind of worlds of esotericism. Many different types of occult thought.
You've been very generous with your time. We really appreciate it. Can you say how any of my deep dickhead viewers who made it this far might be interested in getting involved with Zebrapedia?
Yeah, sure. So the website is fromthepage.com/Zebrapedia. You may find old links out there that link to psu.edu. That page is defunct. It's now just at the From the Page site. I'm hoping to get it an NYU URL at some point in the next year. So stay tuned for that. But for the time being, it's fromthepage.com/Zebrapedia. And yeah, for a little while, the project was kind of chugging along, limping along maybe is better. There was not very much activity there. In the last few months, I've been trying to kind of resuscitate it and get it a little more active. So part of that was kind of taking over as I basically gave myself the title of managing editor. Uh, now that I have power to create accounts and give people access. And so for a little while that was not happening, and now it is happening again. So if you have tried to access it and at some point in the last couple of years and weren't able to, try again, and we'll get you set up.
Now, what's the state of the funding question?
So Rich Doyle has been paying for it through his own personal generosity for the last 10 years or so. He would really like to not be doing that anymore, uh, for understandable reasons.
It's
Uh,
expensive.
yeah, it basically costs something like $1,000 a year to keep it up and running. So it's not super expensive in the turn in in the grand scheme of digital humanities projects. It's actually pretty cheap. But for something for one person to pay for year after year for themselves is definitely getting expensive for Rich for sure. So we are looking into other funding options now. Ideally, we would want to get institutional funding. So that this doesn't have to be paid for by any individual. But we've also talked about maybe having some sort of not subscription basis. We don't want this to be a pay to play thing, but more of a kind of seeking multiple crowdfunding patrons that could keep this up and running. If we had 10 people paying $100 a year, we're set. If we had 20 people paying $50 a year, we're set. So the more people we have, the cheaper it would be individually. And so I'm kind of a booster of that model. I think Rich maybe, well, I don't know. We haven't had a long conversation about it, because I think as I said, institutional funding is the ideal. But if that is too long in coming, then I think maybe uh, passing around of the hat could keep us afloat without having to dig too much deeper into Rich's personal bank account. So.
All righty. And where can we find you online? Are you available on social media or by
Yeah,
email?
I am. I've been using Blue Sky as my main social media for the last couple weeks or months. So it's Secret Terror at bsky.social. I'm also on Instagram at Secret Terror. And the book is available. It comes out April 22nd from MIT Press. It's called The Saucerian. It's available for pre-order now wherever finer books are pre-ordered. So yeah, um, that's about that.
Very cool. Well, it's been a real privilege, and we're very grateful for your generosity here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You have any last closing thoughts for people who are interested in getting more serious about this kind of work? Any advice?
Um, yeah, just keep reading. There's there's always read the footnotes. That is my recommendation.
Read the footnotes.
Read the footnotes, and even if they're endnotes and you have to flip pages,
All
you can
right.
find some great things by chasing down citations.
Cut and print.